When Callum Ashford pushed open the door of the Stelvio penthouse at 11:43 on a Thursday night and saw a shape beneath his covers, his first thought was not anger. His first thought was that the world had made an administrative error, and the world was about to hear about it. He crossed the room in 8 steps. He pulled back the duvet. And what he found was not what he expected, not a threat, not a situation requiring security, but a young woman, deeply, completely, unapologetically asleep, with her shoes still on and her coat still buttoned and a small piece of paper clutched in one hand that had the room number written on it in ink. The wrong number, written correctly, in a hotel that had given her the wrong key. He stood over her for a long moment. She didn't move. She was breathing slowly, the long even breathing of someone who had not slept properly in days and had finally, in the wrong place at the wrong time, run out of the ability to stay awake. Her face was turned slightly toward him, and even in the low light of the room, he could see she was exhausted in the particular way that goes beyond tired and into something more serious. Callum Ashford did not wake her up. Callum stood in his own bedroom and considered his options. The rational option was obvious. Call the front desk, have the situation explained, have the guest relocated, proceed with the original plan of shower, food, 9 hours of sleep. It would take 20 minutes at most, and he would have his room back. This was the option that every reasonable person would have selected without a second thought. He did not select it. He was not entirely sure why. Later he would construct several explanations, each more logical than the actual reason, but in the moment, standing at the side of his own bed looking at a stranger who was sleeping with the particular completeness of someone running on empty, he simply did not want to wake her. Not because he was a soft person. He was not, by most measures, a soft person. But there was something about the quality of her sleep, the absolute depth of it, that communicated something clearly. This was a person who needed exactly what she had accidentally found. And Callum Ashford, who prided himself on reading situations accurately, read this one and made a decision that surprised him. He picked up his phone and called the front desk. When the night manager answered, Callum identified himself without raising his voice and said, in the tone he used when he was being precise rather than aggressive, I am in the penthouse and I need you to pull the access log for my floor for this evening. Specifically, I want to know how a guest ended up in my suite. The night manager went very still on the other end of the phone. Callum said, don't panic. Nobody is in danger. I simply want the information. The access log revealed the error in under 3 minutes. A key assigned to room 414 had been programmed, due to a data entry mistake during a high-pressure check-in period, with access to the penthouse floor. The guest it had been assigned to had checked in at 9:15. The night manager, whose voice had acquired the particular quality of a person preparing for professional consequences, began to apologize at length. Callum said, I am not interested in the apology right now. I want to know the name on the reservation. There was a brief hesitation. Then the name was given. Nadia Osei. Standard booking for 3 nights. Conference rate. He said, she is asleep. He said it in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for all information. She is asleep, and I am not waking her. What I need from you is the suite on the 42nd floor, prepared within the next 30 minutes. I will be sleeping there tonight. You will move her bag to 414 in the morning before she wakes up. The key situation will be corrected, and you will have a written explanation of how this occurred on my desk before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The night manager said, Of course, Mr. Ashford. Immediately, Callum said, Good. He paused. And make sure 414 is upgraded. Not dramatically, but better than what she booked. There was a brief silence. Then the night manager said, Yes, sir. Callum ended the call. He stood in the room for a moment longer, looking at the sleeping figure in his bed, the coat still buttoned, the one shoe still on, the piece of paper still held loosely in one hand. He reached over and gently removed the paper from her fingers. He looked at the number written on it. He put it on the bedside table where she would see it when she woke up. Then he picked up his bag, walked out of his own suite, took the elevator down to 42, and went to sleep in a room that was smaller than he was used to. He slept better than he had in weeks, which he refused to examine too closely. Her name was Nadia Ose. She was 28 years old, and she had arrived at the Stelvio Hotel at 9:15 that evening carrying one bag and a level of exhaustion so profound it had begun to affect her judgment, which was a notable departure from her normal state, because Nadia Ose's judgment was one of the things people who knew her cited most reliably as her defining quality. She was an architect. Not the kind who worked in glass-fronted offices on commissions for wealthy clients who wanted dramatic staircases. She worked for an international development organization, designing low-cost housing and community centers in regions where buildings were the difference between stability and nothing. She had spent the last 11 days in fieldwork on a project site 6 time zones away, working 12-hour days in difficult conditions, sleeping in a temporary structure with a roof that was technically sound but made an alarming noise when the wind came from the east. She had come home to the city for a conference, a 3-day event she had been invited to speak at, and she had booked a single standard room at the Stelvio because the conference rate made it affordable and because for 3 nights she wanted a real bed and a real shower and a room that sealed properly against the wind. It was a modest wish. She was not a person who required luxury. She simply required the basics to function correctly, which at this stage meant sleep, immediately without delay. The check-in desk at 9:15 had been busy. A large group had arrived simultaneously, a corporate party of 20 with complicated room arrangements, and the junior staff member who checked Nadia in was dividing attention between her standard booking and the chaos of the group. She had been given a key. She had been told the room number. She had taken the elevator to the correct floor, or so she believed, and she had pressed the key card to the door and the door had opened, which she had interpreted as confirmation that she was in the right place. She had not noticed that the floor she stepped off the elevator onto was different from the floor on her key sleeve, because her key sleeve had been written by the same distracted hand that had assigned her the incorrect room in the first place. She had walked down a corridor that looked like every other hotel corridor, found the door whose number matched what she had been told, and let herself in. The room was very dark, very quiet, and the bed, when she approached it, was the most welcoming thing she had encountered in 11 days. She sat on the edge of it to remove her shoes. She got one off. The second one proved more complicated because her fingers were not cooperating and her eyes were already closing. She lay back for just a moment, just to rest for 30 seconds before she found her bag and her toiletries. She was asleep before the 30 seconds were up. She slept through the sound of a private elevator arriving on the 44th floor. She slept through the electronic sound of the main door being unlocked. She slept through the footsteps crossing the marble foyer. She slept through the moment a man pulled back the covers and looked down at her in the half-dark with an expression that moved, in the space of about 4 seconds, from authority through confusion to something that did not yet have a name. Nadia woke at 7:14. She knew, in the first 3 seconds of consciousness, that something was wrong with the geometry of where she was. The ceiling was too high. The light coming through the gap in the curtains was coming from the wrong direction. The bed was significantly larger than any standard hotel room bed she had ever been in, which was a notable number of hotel beds across multiple continents. She sat up. She looked around the room. The room was the kind of room that did not look like a room someone had booked at a conference rate. The furniture was not hotel furniture in any sense she recognized. The artwork on the walls was original, she could tell from across the room. The bathroom door was open and she could see marble that appeared to extend in all directions. There was a terrace beyond the main window, and through the glass she could see the entire city laid out below her, which meant she was on a very high floor indeed. Her one shoe was on the floor beside the bed. Her coat was still buttoned. On the bedside table was a small piece of paper with a room number on it, which she recognized as what she had written before checking in, and beside it was a glass of water that had not been there when she fell asleep. She got up slowly. She walked to the main door and opened it and looked at the number on the outside. Then she looked at the number on her piece of paper. They did not match. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about this carefully. The room she was in had been occupied. That was evident from the quality and the specific arrangement of things. This was not a standard room being held for a future booking. Someone lived here, or at least lived here with the regularity that makes a space personal. There was a particular order to it, not the impersonal precision of a hotel turndown, but the order of someone who expected things to be in exact positions and had trained a staff to maintain those positions. Someone had come back to this room last night. Someone had found her here, and that someone had not woken her up. She felt simultaneously enormous gratitude and enormous embarrassment, which is a combination that produces a very specific kind of energy in a person who is used to being competent. She picked up the room phone. She called the front desk. The front desk manager who answered her call had clearly been briefed. His professionalism was so studied it was almost architectural. He apologized for the error on behalf of the hotel in terms that indicated he had rehearsed the language. He informed her that her correct room, 414, had been prepared and her bag had been moved there, and that the hotel was upgrading her room to a superior suite at no additional charge in acknowledgement of the inconvenience. He asked if she required anything further. She said, "I need to know whose room this was." Careful pause. Then, "I am afraid guest information is confidential, Ms. Osei." She said, "I understand." She thought for a moment. She said, "Can you at least tell me if the guest is still in the hotel?" Another pause. Then, "The guest is still on property, yes." She said, "I need to leave a message." Dara placed the folded piece of hotel stationery on his desk at 9:50 with no explanation, which was how she handled things she considered self-explanatory. Callum was on a call. He looked at Dara, and she gave a small tilt of her head that meant read it when you are done. He finished the call. He unfolded the note. He read it once. Then he read it again more slowly. 22 hours awake. The phrasing was exact and unadorned, the kind of writing that belongs to people who have been trained, either by education or experience, to say the precise thing and leave out the decoration. The apology was real, he could tell that, not performed. The acknowledgement of the hotel error had a dry honesty to it that he found oddly refreshing. And the closing line, "If you ever want to tell me how I can return that kindness," had a particular quality he could not immediately categorize. It was not flirtatious. It was not calculating. It was simply direct. An offer made with clean hands. He set the note down. He looked at it on his desk. Dara appeared in the doorway. She said, "The front desk manager submitted his written explanation of the incident as requested. The error has been traced to a data entry mistake during a busy check-in period. He has proposed a staff retraining protocol." Callum said, "Fine. Prove it." He paused. "Dara." She said, "Yes." He said, "The guest in 414. Nadia Osei. What is her conference?" Dara had anticipated this question, which was why she already had her tablet in her hand. She said, "The International Summit on Sustainable Development Architecture. Runs through Saturday." She is a presenter. Her topic was structural design in resource-limited contexts. She presented this morning. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's an architect." Dara said, "A good one, apparently. Her organization has built over 400 projects across 11 countries in the last 6 years." He picked up the note again. He read the last 2 lines one more time. He said, "Send her something from the hotel. Not standard. Something that matches the quality of the note." Dara raised an eyebrow a fraction of a millimeter, which was her version of significant facial expression. He said, "I'll also take lunch in the Beaumont Hall today rather than the executive dining room." Dara said, "The conference lunch is open to registered guests only." Callum said, "I'm aware." A brief pause. Then Dara said, "I will get you a registration pass." The Beaumont Hall was the Stelvio's largest conference space, a long room with high ceilings and the kind of acoustic design that kept noise from becoming overwhelming even when 200 people were eating and talking simultaneously. The conference lunch was a buffet, well catered by the hotel's kitchen, which Callum had personally approved the menu for 3 months ago when the booking came in, though he had not known at the time he would ever eat it himself. He arrived at 12:45. He collected a plate with the straightforward efficiency he applied to all tasks and took a seat at the end of a table near the window where he could see most of the room. He was not in his usual professional attire. He was in a dark sweater and trousers, nothing that announced him. The lanyard he wore said his name and listed his organization as Ashford Group, which was accurate but not specific enough that most people would immediately know what it meant. He found her in 4 minutes. She was at a table near the center of the room, sitting sideways in her chair in the way people sit when they are deep in a conversation they find genuinely interesting. She was talking to 2 other people, both leaning toward her slightly, the way people physically lean when they do not want to miss a word. She was using her hands while she spoke, not dramatically, but with the precise gestures of someone drawing something in the air that is easier to show than to say. She did not look like someone who had been in the wrong room the night before. She looked like someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. He got through half his lunch before she looked up and their eyes met across the room. The recognition was immediate on her side. He could see it move across her face, not alarm, not the particular awkwardness of a person who had been caught in an embarrassing situation, but something more direct than that, surprise, and then something he could only describe as the expression of someone who is reassessing a situation in real time. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said something quietly to the people she was talking to, and she stood up and she walked over to his table. She said, "You're him." He said, "I'm him." She sat down in the empty chair across from him without being invited, which he noted as a quality. She said, "I wrote you a note." He said, "I received it." She said, "I meant every word of it, including the part about the apology being insufficient." She looked at him directly and he noticed her eyes were very clear, the kind of clear that comes from genuineness rather than performance. She said, "You gave up your own room. That was not something you were required to do." He said, "I am aware of what I was and wasn't required to do." She said, "Then why did you do it?" It was not an aggressive question. It was not a flirtatious one. It was a genuine question asked by a person who wanted a genuine answer, and Callum Ashford, who had spent a significant portion of his professional life giving answers that were strategic rather than true, felt the oddness of being asked something he actually wanted to answer honestly. He said, "You were asleep. You looked like someone who needed it more than I did." A pause. She considered this. Then she said, "That is either very kind or very arrogant, and I cannot decide which." He said, "It might be both." Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile exactly. Something that preceded a smile and was in some ways more interesting. She said, "I'm Nadia." He said, "I know." He picked up his glass. He said, "I'm Callum." She said, "I know." The front desk manager has a very expressive face. She paused. "You own this hotel." He said, "Among others." She said, "And you're at the Sustainable Development Architecture Conference." He said, "My firm is considering a partnership with an infrastructure development organization. I've been reviewing the work. Yours came up." She looked at him steadily. She said, "You read my work." He said, "I read the summary. I'd like to hear the rest." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who have arrived somewhere simultaneously without having planned the route. She said, "I have a panel at 2. But I'm free from 4. He said, "I know a good place in this hotel for a conversation." She said, "The Penthouse?" He said, "The terrace bar on 38. The Penthouse has certain associations now." She laughed. It was a short, genuine laugh, and it changed the quality of the room around him by a small but measurable amount. The terrace bar on the 38th floor was a narrow outdoor space that wrapped around the building's south face, lined with low planters of ornamental grass that moved in the wind off the city. In the late afternoon, the light came at an angle that made the buildings below look like they were made of amber. It was Callum's favorite place in the hotel, the one that had made him agree to buy the property in the first place when the previous owner had brought him there on a clear September afternoon and said simply, "Look at this." Nadia arrived at 4:03. She had changed out of the clothes she had presented in, which were formal and structured, and was wearing something simpler, dark trousers and a light jacket, the kind of clothes that belonged to someone whose comfort mattered more than impression. She looked at the view when she stepped out onto the terrace and said nothing for a moment. He respected that about her, that she let things be what they were before she described them. They ordered tea, both of them, which he noted because most people in his professional world ordered things that took longer to describe than to drink. She sat across from him and folded her hands on the table and said, "All right." Ask me what you actually want to know. He said, tell me about the housing projects. She said, which ones? He said, the ones in the East. RN Coastal Program. Your organization built 240 units in 14 months in conditions that most contractors would have walked away from. She was quiet for a half a second, the pause of someone who has been asked a question by a person who has done the actual reading. Then she talked. She talked about materials and logistics and the community consultation process she insisted on before every project began, even when the timeline pressure made it inconvenient, especially when the timeline pressure made it inconvenient. She talked about a specific structural challenge they had encountered in one site where the soil composition made conventional foundations inadequate, and the solution she had devised that had since been adapted for 2 other projects in different regions. She talked with her hands again, drawing things in the air, and he watched her hands because they were precise and the things they described were real. He asked questions. Not the questions of someone performing interest, the questions of someone who understood enough to know what he did not understand yet. She answered them with the same directness she had shown in everything since the moment she walked across the conference room to his table. At some point the tea was replaced with wine, which neither of them had requested but both accepted without pausing the conversation. The amber light shifted to something cooler. The city below changed from gold to gray to the particular blue of a city at the beginning of night, when the lights come on individually like decisions being made. She said, eventually you came to this conference for a business reason. He said, yes. She said, and now you're asking me things that have nothing to do with a business decision. He said, I know what I need to know for the business decision. This is something else. She looked at him with the same clear directness she had used from the first moment. She said, what is it, then? He said, I'm not certain yet. She considered this. Then she said, that's a more honest answer than I expected. He said, you seem like someone who would notice the difference. She said, I do. They sat in that for a moment, the city going blue beneath them, the wind moving the ornamental grass in low quiet waves. He had a full schedule on Friday. He always had a full schedule. Dara had it arranged with the precision of a piece of engineering: 8:30 call with Geneva, 10 o'clock internal review, 11:30 property walkthrough with the facilities director, lunch with an investor at 2:30 legal briefing. It was a schedule built for a man who intended to spend Friday being completely unavailable to anything that was not already on it. He moved the 2:30 legal briefing to Monday at 8 in the morning, which made Dara look at him for a long moment over her glasses before writing the change without comment. The conference had a free afternoon session on Friday, an unstructured period intended for networking. Callum arrived in the Beaumont Hall at 2:15, not because he was early, but because he had walked from his 11:30 meeting with what Dara later described, privately and to no one, as slightly less purpose than usual. Nadia was in a corner of the hall talking to a small group of younger architects, graduate students by the look of them, who had attended her session and had the particular focused energy of people asking questions they had been saving all week. She was answering them the same way she answered everything, directly, without the condescension that experts sometimes carry without noticing it. She was pointing at something on a laptop screen that someone had brought over, leaning in to look more closely, saying something that made 2 of the group write things down simultaneously. He waited. He was not a patient man generally, but he found that waiting for this particular person to finish what she was doing did not feel like waiting in the usual sense. It felt like watching something that was worth watching. When the group dispersed, she looked up and found him. She said, you rearranged your afternoon. He said, how do you know? She said, because yesterday you said you had calls until 3 and you're here at 2:15. She tilted her head. You don't seem like a man who gets early by accident. He said, I don't. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, there's a part of the city I want to see while I'm here. There's a housing project I read about, the Westbrook Terrace development. It's about 20 minutes from here. I was going to go alone. He said, you don't have to go alone. She said, I know. She paused. That's why I'm telling you. They walked through the Westbrook development for an hour and a half, and it was the most interesting hour and a half Callum had spent in longer than he could accurately remember. Not because anything extraordinary happened. Because Nadia Osei moved through a built environment the way musicians hear music, noticing things at a register that most people did not know existed. She noticed the orientation of buildings relative to the sun and what it meant for the residents in winter. She noticed where the communal spaces had been positioned and whether people were actually using them and why or why not. She stopped at a particular junction between two buildings and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Someone made a good decision here," and he asked what she meant and she explained and he saw it, and the seeing of it was like being handed a language he had not known he was missing. He was, by the time they walked back to the hotel, paying a different quality of attention to the world around him than he had been paying when he left it. He was not accustomed to that. He was not sure yet whether it was comfortable or not. He suspected comfort was not the relevant measure. He asked her to dinner in the way he did most things, directly and without preamble. He said, "Have dinner with me tonight." Not a question. She said, "Where?" He said, "Here or somewhere else." She said, "Somewhere else." He said, "Good answer." He took her to a small restaurant 3 blocks from the hotel that was not famous and not reviewed and was known exclusively by the people who had been going there for years because the food was extraordinary and the room was quiet enough for conversation. The kind of place that exists in every city and is protected by the fact that the people who know about it do not talk about it loudly. They sat across from each other at a corner table and ordered without ceremony and talked for 3 hours. She told him about the project that had started the work she was doing now. A single building in a coastal town that a community had needed for 6 years and had been promised and repromised and never delivered until her organization arrived with a 4-month timeline and a design that used local materials and hired local labor and was finished in 14 weeks. She had been 23 years old and it was the first building that was entirely hers, and she had stood in front of it on the morning it opened and felt something she had not been able to describe to anyone since, though she tried now, haltingly, to describe it to him. He listened without interrupting. He listened the way he had noticed she listened, completely, without the background processing of what he would say next. He told her things he did not regularly tell people. He told her about the road that had named his hotel, the mountain pass, the borrowed car, the 40 minutes of peace. He told her that he had been building things since he was 19, and that the motivation had shifted at least 3 times along the way, and that he was not always certain the current version of his motivation was the one he was most proud of. She asked him which version he was most proud of. He thought about it for a moment and said the first one, when he was simply trying to solve a problem that bothered him and money had nothing to do with it yet. She said, "You could get back to that." He said, "It's more complicated now." She said, "Most things are. That doesn't mean they can't be moved." He looked at her across the table and felt the precise quality of being seen by someone who was not trying to see him for any strategic reason. It was disorienting in a way that was worth staying with. He said, "The partnership my firm is considering with your organization." She said, "Yes." He said, "I'm going to move forward with it. But that's not why I'm telling you." She said, "Why are you telling me?" He said, "Because you should know the professional conversation is settled, and everything after this is a different kind of conversation." She was quiet for a moment. The restaurant was very still around them, the good kind of still, the kind that holds rather than empties. She said, "I know." He was up at 6, which was his habit regardless of what time he had returned to the hotel. He made coffee in the suite on 42, which was still his suite because he had not returned to the penthouse since the night of the error, and stood at the window in the early morning light of the city and thought about several things in sequence, the way he thought about things when he was being honest with himself rather than efficient. He thought about the company he had built at 19 and the thing it had felt like before it was worth anything, just the pure forward motion of solving a real problem with everything you had. He thought about the mountain pass in northern Italy and what exactly it had been about those 40 minutes that had been different from every other 40 minutes in the vicinity. He thought about a woman who moved through buildings the way he had moved through businesses in the early years, with the specific quality of attention that is only available to people who care about the thing itself and not what the thing represents. He called Dara at 6:15, which she accepted without comment because this was not unusual and she always had her phone. He said, "The Ashford Foundation's infrastructure division. Pull everything we have on the operational model. I want to look at it this weekend." Dara said, "The review was scheduled for March." He said, "I want to look at it this weekend." A brief pause. Then, "I'll have it on your tablet by 8. He said, "Thank you." He paused. "And Dara, She said, yes. He said, have a room made available on the 44th floor. The guest suite, not the penthouse. For visiting partners who might need city accommodation during the foundation review process. Another pause, slightly longer this time. Then Dara said, understood. Is there a particular partner you have in mind? He said, there might be. She said, I'll have it prepared. He drank his coffee. He watched the city come into its morning, the light changing the surfaces of buildings, the slow increase of movement in the streets below. He felt, for the first time in what he estimated was several years, that the next week contained things he was genuinely looking forward to. Not things to be managed or completed or optimized. Things to be in. It was an unfamiliar sensation. He decided he could adjust to it. Saturday's final conference session ended at noon. Nadia stood at the back of the Beaumont Hall afterward, talking to the event organizer about the follow-up publication that was planned for the presentations, and across the room Callum stood near the window with a coffee he had not finished and watched the session end and the room begin to empty. She saw him and came over when the conversation finished. She said, last day. He said, for the conference. She said, I fly back Monday morning. He said, that's 2 days from now. She said, I'm aware of the calendar. He said, I'm asking because I have 2 days also and I would rather spend them differently than I planned to. She looked at him with the quiet directness that was, he had decided, the thing about her he found most remarkable. Not her intelligence, which was exceptional. Not the quality of her work, which was serious and real and the kind of thing the world needed more of. The directness. The complete absence of management in how she engaged with him. He was not accustomed to people who did not manage him, who did not calculate the angle of their approach based on what they needed from him. She had never needed anything from him except, inadvertently, a good night's sleep. She said, I want to see the cathedral district on the east side. I read about the restoration project, and I want to have a meal somewhere that is not a hotel. He said, I know both those things. She said, I know you do. She picked up her bag from the chair beside her. She said, give me 20 minutes to change and I'll meet you downstairs. He said, take 30. He paused. The coat you wore when you arrived could use replacing. She looked at him for a moment. She said, that coat is fine. He said, it had a broken button on the left cuff and the lining was fraying at the hem. I noticed on the first night. A pause. Then she said, with the tone of someone choosing their response carefully, you notice a lot. He said, I notice the things that matter. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, 25 minutes. Don't be obnoxious about the coat. He said, noted. She walked toward the exit with the same decisive step she used for everything, and he watched her go, and the room around her felt emptier in a specific and measurable way the moment she left it.